everybody. Welcome to another week of NextView's two public water cooler chat. So I'm Melody, I'm one of the partners here, and we have Lee and Rob as well, and Nicole on this week. For those who have been with us before, the format is a little different because we now have webinar feature. So hopefully it will be a more controlled environment. We'll keep it pretty casual. We have a few topics that we prepare to talk through for the first 15 minutes or so. And then Rob is gonna kick off a mini interview with Will, the founder CEO of Whoop, which happens to be one of our portfolio companies. So let's get started.
And for those folks who are joining us who haven't joined one of these, we've been doing kind of a series of these around the water cooler chats. They're reasonably unstructured, fairly unstructured. It's kind of replicating a little bit of a view into what happens at a venture capital firm and some things that we talk about. But it's also what's going on in the world, what's going on in society, in addition to what's going on in the kind of VC and startup ecosystem. So that's it. So why don't, Melanie, as you're saying, why don't we jump into some of the topics that we had? Yeah,
and for folks who are on, feel free to submit your questions through, Nicole, should we do it through Q&A or chat, or are they effectively the same?
I think they're effectively the same. So.
Okay, cool. So let's do chat then. If folks, as we talk, we'll make sure to monitor the chat, and to the extent we can, we'll address some of the questions. We want to make this somewhat conversational, so that's the kind of the ground rules for engagement. So let's get started. So every time we've done this over the past couple of weeks, we've started with some COVID news and the latest perspective. So the good news, I'm sitting in New York. The good news is that I think everywhere in the country, including the hotspot like New York, things are slowing down a little bit in terms of new cases, hospitalizations, and whatnot. Yesterday or 2 days ago, there's the glimmer of good news where there seems to be some promising early results from this clinical trial from Gilead, and the stock market got really excited, and the market has been doing well the past day or so. We, during our internal conversation, Lee especially had a strong point of view on
hey guys,
how he think. Hey, how's it going, Will?
Hey, Will.
Hey,
nice meeting you. We actually haven't met.
I know, great to meet you as well.
Oh,
yeah.
I should get my Whoop hat.
I know, I got my Whoop hat downstairs. Actually, I should grab it. It's not up here in my home office. I've got my Whoop on, but
I won't hold that against you guys.
That's good.
And,
so, Will, we're doing a 15-minute just chit chat, and then we're gonna do a broader chit chat with you, and that's the plan.
Great.
So we were just talking about.
Melody's just talking COVID.
We're talking about COVID.
Yeah, so we were just talking about COVID, and it was interesting. Just before this, I was on a Zoom. There you go. You got your Whoop hat.
Nice.
Just before this Zoom, I was on another video conference with a VC based in San Francisco, and he started off, and someone I've known for a number of years. And he started off the conversation with, "Are you team Elon? Or are you team Balaji?" So for people who follow, either Elon Musk or I'm going to mispronounce the gentleman's name, Balaji, on Twitter, who kind of opposite ends of the spectrum of, Elon's been skeptical about the some of the health impacts of and whether kind of societal and economic lockdowns have been necessary, and then folks at the other end of the spectrum who are quite concerned about the public health situation and the risks of loosening restrictions too soon. So he basically framed it as that. He's like, are you team Elon or are you team Balaji? And the reality is I'm actually somewhere in the middle. We had an interesting chat about it, but something that I've been thinking about and chatting with people, privately and in small groups has been, I think there's an interesting confluence of events and things that are happening basically right now, where I'm not saying that this is my base case assumption or that I'm saying this purely as an optimist, but just as 2 months ago, most of the United States and much of the world was sort of surprised and shocked to the downside about the potential impact of the coronavirus spreading in society and the resultant lockdowns. We all were going about our lives and had this massive downside shock, because expectations have been set at a pretty low baseline as to the risks on the public health side and the necessity of fairly stringent economic and societal restrictions. I actually think we're in an environment where if there's any surprise to the upside or to the downside, it's far more likely to be the upside, just given the baseline assumptions of negativity that people have had. And I'm not saying that that's my assumption of what's going to happen or my prediction of what's going to happen in the next month or two, or even that I think that the risks or don't outweigh some of the potential benefits. But the confluence of events that we were talking about internally were, one, this week we got a kind of ray of light on the potential for treatments like the Gilead drug resmetirom. I can't pronounce it properly, but where it's entirely possible that in the next couple weeks or couple months, some of the treatments that various life sciences and biotech companies have been working on might prove effective for treating some of the most serious cases. The second has been, obviously there's been now a little bit more serological data of testing of, how widely are antibodies dispersed in populations in New York City, in California, and different European countries. And, the possibility, the data is not entirely decisive or clear at this point, but there is the possibility that this novel coronavirus has spread far more widely in society than, confirmed cases would indicate. But conversely, that also means that, sort of the overall fatality rate is lower than would be indicated by the confirmed cases. And then the third is, certain countries in Europe and some states in the United States here are starting to loosen their restrictions around, various stay-at-home orders and societal and economic restrictions. And so, hopefully they go well. They may go not well. We don't really know yet. But in the next few weeks, this experiment will be run as to, what happens as certain restrictions get loosened in certain places. And if it goes, well or even reasonably well, we may all be readjusting our assumptions of what the near-term future looks like based on, if the severity of, if the virus is more widespread than we think, and the fatality rate is potentially lower, based on that. And there are some treatments to help those that are most at risk and those, facing more serious cases. And if, as economic restrictions get loosened in some places, if that doesn't result in, a significant second wave or significant public health, crunch in hospital capacity, we may have to readjust a lot of us have been sort of forming our perspective as to, we're going to have to be hunkered down for quite some time. And, things could change to the upside, more quickly than a lot of people expect. Again, I'm not necessarily predicting that, or I'm not doing this out of a pure optimism point of view. I just think that our baseline assumptions have been pushed quite negative by the experience of the last month and a half or so, that if there's an unexpected thing to happen in the next few months, it's far more likely to be to the upside than to the downside. So that was my thinking on it.
So I've had a somewhat different point of view, which is that the baseline assumption, I had this impossible to understand tweet earlier this week, which was that the baseline assumption is the average of a bimodal distribution, meaning that the far more likely scenarios are either it's going to be a lot better, like Lee's potentially suggesting, or it's going to be a lot worse. But what's unlikely is actually what the baseline assumption is. And my argument would be sort of on the positive side, everything that Lee's saying. On the negative being, we have a little bit of a delayed effect of the immediate economic impact of this recession. There's an outside chance that, even if you've developed the antibodies, what if that doesn't necessarily result in, being able to avoid the disease? What if there's a massive delay in the, we have no reason to believe that an antibody is going to be widely available within 12 and 18 months, which is what I think most people today are thinking is going to happen, but there's
Vaccine,
some
yeah.
evidence that that's not the case. A vaccine.
Yeah.
And all of the strides that the United States have made and other countries in terms of containing the virus are basically going to go out the window the minute you let anybody out of the house again. So, I think it's far more likely that things are hopefully a lot better or massively worse. But the assumption that most people have is more likely to be wrong, I think.
Yeah, the human brain's not, just as the human brain's not good at wrapping its head around exponential growth, it's unnatural for us to wrap our heads around bimodal distributions, right? Where, the average actually is misleading because it's more likely that one thing at one extreme or one thing at another extreme is likely to happen. So, it's
That's actually what happens in venture capital, though.
Yes, that is true.
Most
That's
of the
correct.
time.
Startups are, not it's not a normal distribution of outcomes. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
We actually had a question. Sorry, go ahead, Rob. Actually, by the way, Will, not to put you on the spot, I don't know if you've had any thoughts on what the near future, the next couple of months looks like.
Well, there's sort of the underlying policy decisions have some calculation of what is a death worth in economic value, or what's the probability of a death worth in economic value. And just through purely that lens, it does seem like we've now erred too far on the side of the value of or not enough on the value of economic prosperity. And so you're seeing a lot of states reopen because they view the risks, all the other risks associated with a crashed economy actually now becoming greater than the virus itself. And I think what's going to happen is businesses, people in general, are going to innovate within these new sort of concepts of partially open. And so I think it's more likely that we're looking at a phased world into reopening than it is a start, stop type world. And I think that it does feel like the cat's a little out of the bag with people just saying, okay, we're moving back towards Sweden. And I would say that I think that there's certain populations that are just clearly more at risk than other populations. So I would say I'm more in the camp of trying to find a solution that protects those people versus blanket says everyone should work from home.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting by historical, like we've all become armchair epidemiologists. I've always been a fan and student of history, and so I've read a variety of things about past pandemics. And people talk about the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, but also, a variety. There have been a variety of outbreaks that occurred in the late 50s and the 60s and other points of time. And I was reading one about kind of a flu epidemic that occurred in 1957, I believe it was, which is only about a decade after World War II, and it was interesting reading about the way individual people perceived that situation and the way that societies and economies and governments responded to it. There's a very different, in 2020, we're fortunate that the vast, especially those of us who live here in the United States, we've lived through a period of decades of, relative prosperity, peace, advance of science and confidence in medical technology. And it has meant that we have potentially a less, a view that every human being and every human life can be protected to a very, very high degree. And we're not accustomed to really, really, really terrible situations, which was different in 1957, right? You know, the world had just lived through a pretty horrific period with World War II. And not that human life or prosperity or other things were valued in different ways, but that there was more of a, you know, sort of an acceptance or fatalistic view that bad things happen in the world, and society's ability to prevent them is somewhat limited. Whereas I think we live in a time now where, because we've been fortunate to live in a period of, you know, decades of peace and prosperity and improving health and improving lifespans and everything else, you know, the viewpoint is a little bit different. It's just interesting historical juxtaposition in terms of how society views the world, and how relative periods of peace and prosperity and relative periods of upheaval and war and other things have, you know, changed the way society looks at things.
So we have we had a question on Q&A, and everybody, please, I encourage you to pose some questions. But it's the question was for B2B companies that depend on in-person meetings to close sales and build partnerships. With COVID-19, these meetings are hard to come by, and, you know, what are some suggestions on how to overcome that? This actually reminds me of a tweet, Will, that you had a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, and you said something to the effect of, like, the person you always wanted to talk to is literally sitting at home waiting for you to call, like pick up the phone and talk to them. Can you like unpack that? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's I think one thing that's really unique about this moment in time is that people, especially people who sort of travel all the time, celebrity types who are constantly at bookings, events, whose calendars are normally like booked by the, you know, 5-minute increment. Those people I've found are surprisingly available right now in a way that they just historically have never been. And they actually themselves are becoming, I think, sort of antsy as a result of it. So they're sitting somewhat idle. And I've noticed this with a bunch of athletes, for example, because we work more in that space. But I do think it's true that this is probably one of the best times in the last 20 years to like cold email someone, cold call someone, figure out a way to get in touch with someone, because my sense is it's just an unusually disruptive time for that.
Yeah, I would agree with the caveat that you know, I think in the traditional B2B sales environment, you know, a lot of the outbound outreach is you know, kind of within the course of normal business. And so I think, you know, the way to learn from, you know, reaching out to an athlete or somebody like that versus reaching out to, you know, a VP of whatever that you're trying to sell to is you might be able to get in touch with people who otherwise are quite busy, not with a traditional sales pitch, but with a, you know, just seeking out their insight or seeking out, you know, their counsel or you know, exchange of ideas. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's harder to move like the traditional funnel forward through the typical means, but it's actually a great time to like develop some air cover for your company or evangelize the benefits of your product or just like understand an organization maybe at a level that's more senior than you're used to engaging. So I think it's an interesting time from that standpoint. Will, why don't we kind of just started chatting, but like, do you want to give us a bit of the elevator pitch on what Whoop is up to and what you guys do?
Yeah, so at Whoop, our mission is to unlock human performance. So we build technology across hardware and software and analytics that's designed to better understand the human body. And in particular, we collect a lot more data than other products on the market, and that makes the product more accurate. And we give lots of feedback around how you sleep and whether your body's recovering, you know, the stress of workouts, the stress of your overall day. And so we effectively sell a membership for understanding your body, and it serves as a 24/7 coach to help you improve. Whoop today is almost 8 years old. It was founded out of Harvard about 8 years ago. I got into the space because I was into sports and exercise, and did a ton of research around that and wanted to better understand the human body. And today we're about 150 people, and we're based in the Fenway.
Right in Boston. Right in Boston. So Will, counterintuitively, I think the fact that people are sheltering in place, the fact that, professional and collegiate athletes are not, doing what they're normally doing, you'd think that means that a lot of the people who use Whoop, both your consumer user base and some of the athletes that use it, would be, would be less visible in their lives. In fact, actually, my perception has been Whoop's been visible both publicly and in your customers' lives a little bit more right now with, you're doing some research with respiratory rate and COVID-19. And I'm curious, like why do you think that's been the case, or what's been, as you guys have been navigating this period, like with your customers, why is it that, you've been able to, raise the profile and engage with your customers, even though some of their normal activities of going, we're going out and exercising and trying to do as much as we can, but gyms are closed and we may not be able to go ride our bike, and, pro athletes aren't out playing, games right now.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And like, I think the first thing that comes to mind is we did work quite hard to make ourselves relevant in this moment in time. Like, in early March, I think we were the first consumer app to launch COVID-19 tracking in the app. So, the same way a Whoop member could report that they were sick or they felt run down, they could now report that they had COVID-19. And we now have a data set of about 1,000 people who have reported having COVID-19 and a bunch of symptoms to go with it. And we've been able to partner with Cleveland Clinic and CQU, who are two of the leading research institutions around COVID-19 and in general. And we're now in the process of publishing research in medical journals that's on an expedited path because of how compelling the data is that we've found. One way to think about physiological data as a predictor or a precursor or as an indicator of any type of illness is whether it's a non-specific indicator or a specific indicator. So what would be a non-specific indicator that Whoop might measure? Well, it turns out if you have a general virus or the flu or even COVID-19, we see all of the following. So we'll see your resting heart rate will be quite elevated. We'll see that your heart rate variability, which we may or may not talk about, it's this sort of fascinating lens into your autonomic nervous system. We'll see that come down considerably. We'll see you get a red recovery on Whoop, which is like our measurement of how prepared your body is for the day. We'll see disruptions in your sleep quality. All of these things happen regardless of whether it's a cold or a flu or COVID-19. So you can think of those as non-specific indicators. What's powerful and what we've seen with COVID-19 is that it dramatically increases your respiratory rate. And this seems to occur as much as 3 days before you actually feel symptoms. Now, there's good reason for this because COVID-19 is a respiratory tract infection, a lower respiratory tract infection, and therefore it makes sense that it would trigger a higher respiratory rate. Respiratory rate, for people listening, is the number of breaths that you take in a minute. And we measure while you're sleeping because it's effectively a control, right? So we're capturing it in the same way every night. And it's actually a really boring statistic, at least it has been for a long time. We've always measured it. We have third-party validation to show that we measure it really accurately. But it wasn't even something that we surfaced to users, in part because we don't like to show users things that aren't interesting. And now it's this sort of ironic thing where the most boring statistic on Whoop is the one that everyone's looking at the most because you don't want it to change. And for the people that have gotten COVID-19 on Whoop, we've seen a respiratory rate that like jumps between 10 and 30% off of their baseline. So to put that in perspective, my respiratory rate is 13. it's been 13 literally every single day for 6 months. If I were to get COVID-19, I would expect that it would jump to as high as 15 or 16, maybe even 17. So it jumps off the page. It's so obvious. And so I think that, I mean, a lot of that research and the fact that we've released these things very quickly, and now respiratory rate is something you can view in the app, and we've published a lot of research around this and podcasts and whatnot. I think that's probably made Whoop uniquely relevant to the moment. I think there's some characteristics about Whoop that make it that make this moment in time not as bad as other companies. So, for example, everyone cares a lot more about their health. But I think if you were to look at demand for, I don't know, Fitbit or Garmin or Apple Watch, other products that we might consider competitors, my sense is that you would probably see demand has decreased for those products. And yet for Whoop, we've seen demand increase for our products. So I think it's probably largely the way we've responded to the moment, but it's in part, there's some things about society's focus on health.
That's really cool.
What's been interesting has been how much like Whoop has become like a media topic, or not even like a mainstream media. Like, you know, as you know, I'm a big golfer, and I'm insanely jealous that you got to talk to Rory McIlroy. And if you follow that guy on Instagram, or Justin Thomas or some other guys, like they're posting their Whoop, their recovery scores every day. They're like competing against their Whoop data. Like, that's kind of crazy. I mean, maybe it's just because there's nothing else for them to do. And so it's like this moment in time where all they're doing all day is working out and trying to prove that they worked out, or that they're really good at sleeping, because apparently Rory's really good at sleeping.
Yeah, like it's been fascinating just how much time these athletes have on their hands. I think part of it's that they've got time on their hands. I think the other part of it is sort of the general fascination with their Whoop data. And we've gotten to a place now where enough interesting people wear Whoop and post about it that it makes the other interesting people post about it. And so it makes not paying these famous people very easy as a result.
So, good.
Good, Rob.
Good.
No, I was going to say, actually, on that topic, you've gotten a number of very high-profile athletes and others to use the product. We're talking about, you know, professional golfers, professional basketball players, Olympians. You know, how both. And by the way, this is true not just now when, you know, there's a lot of you know, sort of brand recognition of Whoop and a lot of media coverage of the company, the business, but even in the early days of the company when you know, you were still building things from a small stage. How did you do that, or what were the tricks or tips that you had there?
Yeah, I think there were a few strong points of view. One was that we weren't going to pay athletes to wear Whoop, and if we built the product that we wanted to build, they would wear it for free or even pay us because they would be getting so much value out of it. But if we built the product that we didn't want to build, there was no amount of money that we could pay them that was going to make them wear this thing 24/7 if they weren't getting value. So that was, I would say, a point of view that we had for probably as early as we've met you guys, you know, back in 2013 or so. Another sort of insight I would say was that the secret to getting to someone really famous or successful is identifying a person in their life who is really important, who other people don't know. So, okay, LeBron James was wearing Whoop in commercials back in 2015, right, when he was at the peak of his powers. How did we get Whoop on LeBron James? Well, it turns out that everyone knows who his coach is, who his trainer is, who his wife is, who his agent is. Actually, not that many people knew who his personal trainer was. And he spends about 9 hours a day with his personal trainer. So, you know, we were able to get to his personal trainer, and then he started wearing Whoop. And sure, at some point the product has to live up to its promise too, right? So in the case of the people that we were targeting, we were also promising something that other people weren't doing well or weren't promising. A lot of that was around sleep and recovery, which was our, I would say, contrarian point of view, dating back 8 years ago, which is that the secret to performance was not actually measuring more about performance. It was understanding the other 20 hours of the day and understanding sleep and recovery, which at the time was actually a fairly contrarian point of view. Now it's largely turned out to be what people are talking about. So that was one of the insights, was at finding ways to get to these influential people. And then I think we got to a certain profile. And also there was a marketing strategy there too, where we were really targeting these people. Like, we wanted them to wear the product. We went after teams. We went after coaches. We charged like a very large amount of money for the service, because everything else that they were getting for free sort of had this stigma associated with it. So those were some of the things that we did. And then of course you get to a certain inflection where you've created a brand, and I think we're demonstrating that now. And you know, a guy like Rory McIlroy will be texting with Andy Murray and, you know, saying you should get on Whoop, and you know, it just sort of goes like that.
It's a magical thing.
We had a question from the audience here, actually regarding, you started to touch on, you know, the price point and how you thought about selling the product. But the question was specifically, I'll read it. Hey, Will, big fan of Whoop, just recently became a customer. Compared to other companies, i.e. Fitbit and Apple Watch in the space, Whoop has a pretty unique business model focused around membership. Can you unpack how you think about that and ways you see it evolving? Thanks. And I know a little bit of the story, having been an early investor in the company, that's not actually where you guys started. You started with a model that looked a little bit more like Apple Watch or Fitbit, but at a premium price point, and then you evolved it. But maybe you can share with the group the kind of perspective and how you guys thought about it and where it goes from here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question, and thank you for being on Whoop. Pleased to have you. So, you know, I think as an entrepreneur, you're constantly deciding how many things do you actually need to innovate around. And it didn't occur to us for a long time that we actually needed to innovate all that much around our business model, but it's become pretty core to actually our DNA as a company. So we originally would sell Whoop to teams and high performing athletes for as much as like, you know, $1,000 per person per year. So we had some origins of a subscription, but to be fair, that wasn't a very big business for us. And a lot of it was building brand recognition while we were trying to develop what we thought could be a scalable consumer product. We eventually launched a consumer product, and we introduced it at a $500 price point, which, you know, is quite premium if you look at other products in the market then and now. And what we saw over the course of the next 18 months is that we had high engagement for the people who had bought that product. We didn't see the same drop-off rates that had plagued earlier wearables like Fitbit and Jawbone, for example. However, we weren't selling a lot of units, and we recognized that if our entry point could be much lower, but potentially with some monthly rate, there could be a better business model for both Whoop and for the customer. And so that's where we got this idea of introducing Whoop entirely as a subscription. And you can get Whoop today for as low as $18 a month and have the hardware be free and included. Separately from that, and this is more of a business point of view, this is around 2007, 2018, while we're sort of debating this in the background. You know, Fitbit was a publicly traded company and doing about 1x revenue as a hardware business. They were valued, at like 1x revenue, which is pretty tough from a public market. And Peloton, which was a private company at the time, was being valued as high as like 20x ARR. And so just in terms of, well, do you want to grow up to be valued like a business that looks like Fitbit, or do you want to grow up to be valued like a business that looks like Peloton? It was obvious that we wanted to look more like Peloton. And then I would say the last consideration, which was pretty customer centric, was what is core to the Whoop user experience. And a lot of it also turned out to be helping people understand their data, releasing features at a much faster cadence than other products, analytics, software. And so that also lent itself to this concept that understanding your body wasn't a one-time fee, but it was something that you pay over time. And by the way, if you don't get value from us over time, cancel, right? So that was the stake that we put in the ground to the market. And, you know, it's probably one of the best single 3 or 5 decisions that we've made in building the business.
As you've gone, you know, from your roots of, you know, serving high performance athletes to more and more, you know, kind of people like me who have
Louis.
wishful thinking. What was that? Oh.
Sorry, I was just responding to Louis. Thanks.
Oh yeah. What's your thoughts when people say, well, is this for me? I'm just like an average Joe. I'm not training for anything significant, but this seems interesting. Seems like there's health benefits. How do you make use of Whoop? What's your thought there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, Whoop isn't just for athletes. I think the thing that holds our whole population together, our audience together, is a desire to improve at something, you know, and, you know, we have executives, we have doctors, cops, surgeons, firemen, health workers, you know, fitness enthusiasts, sure, endurance competitors, but really a fairly wide population of people that wears, yeah, military. Yeah. Military obviously looks a little more alpha, but like, you know, in terms of general population, it's actually fairly well represented on Whoop. And I think a lot of that is because Whoop is good, I think, at helping you figure out what are a few things that you can tweak about your lifestyle or your body or your habits that help you perform at a higher level. And one of the features that we released recently was this concept of it's called the Whoop Journal, but it effectively allows you to track against 40 or 50 different behaviors in your life and actually try to figure out what are some things in my life that are effective or ineffective for how my body is responding. So you may discover, for example, that caffeine in the afternoon affects the way you sleep, or, you know, alcohol, unfortunately, has a profoundly bad effect on almost everything, or you know, meditation in the morning even helps the way you sleep. So there's just a lot of different things that you can look at. Those are just a few examples, and we've found that in turn has broadened our audience. The other thing that I'll say is, like, just because you're a professional athlete doesn't mean you want more numbers and more data. You know, people in general, we designed this product to be as simple as possible, really, from the earliest days. And we wanted it to always feel like a consumer product. So even though we were targeting a very high-end athlete, like, the core interface is still exactly the same as it was for, you know, these professional athletes as it is for the everyday consumer. And I think a lot of that is just trying to organize data to tell you what you need to know, versus this concept that you have a super high level person who wants to know everything and you have someone else who only wants to know a few things. I actually think you want to assume everyone only wants to know a few things.
Do you find that most new users are, like, really impatient to understand what's going on? Like, because a lot of this is based on, like, improvement, right? It's like if you follow the recommendations, you change your lifestyle, a lot of things improve. But you must get a lot of people who are like, man, my HRV is this, that seems really low, or that seems really high. Like, what does that mean? My heart rate looks like this. Like, are there immediate things that you can learn? And how do you get people to just, like, stay patient and kind of stick with the program?
Well, the two fastest pieces of feedback that we get are one, I don't get as much sleep as I thought. And two, I can't believe Whoop knows when I drink alcohol, because that like jumps off, it really jumps off the page. And so those are sort of immediate moments of realization. I think that some of the lifestyle stuff that I was just describing, that happens after, you know, weeks and months. That's not your, you know, 2 days on Whoop and now you know whether you're in a healthy relationship or not. You know, that's like, it takes more time to sort of unpack some of those things. And I think, again, back to the membership, people are willing to give it more time to figure out their bodies, in part because of the way the business model is set up.
So my HRVs, I mean, this is a selfish question, but I'm going to ask it because you're here. Like,
Sure.
I have a, you know, I look at Dave and Lee's scores, and I have some other friends who are on it. My HRV is like super low, like 20. What does that mean? Am I gonna have a heart attack?
So heart rate variability, for people listening to this, is the amount of time in between beats of your heart, and you effectively want it to be high. It's the variability of that time, and the more variability, the better. And it's a really interesting lens into your autonomic nervous system. Anyway, it doesn't mean you're dying, no. But in general, what you want to do is figure out what your baseline is and then try to improve from there. So we try to avoid having people compare theirs to others. Of course, it's amazing that like Michael Phelps has an HRV of 300, and you know, sort of these heroic cardiovascular athletes. But in general, the most important thing is finding ways to improve your personal HRV. And one thing to know is that it declines with age. So if you have the same HRV that you did at age, 42 that you had at 39, that's actually a really good sign. It's a sign that you've gotten fitter or healthier over the course of that time period. And I would say one general theme for Whoop is that we're constantly like baselining people and giving them feedback on how they're changing from that baseline, whether positive or negative.
Dave's a runner. He has the highest HRV of the three of us.
Apparently, all I do is like sit around and eat Doritos.
Dave, Dave Beisel. So Dave, Rob, and I, we're all, the three of us, we're all in our early 40s. We're all kind of at the same, similar life stage.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and we're business partners and friends, and so it's interesting to see each other's sort of scores and stuff.
Have you ever looked at at one of your partners' recoveries on the day of like a partner meeting and been like, Rob, 12%. I don't know if you're ready to make this call today.
Yeah, that's right. I don't trust your judgment today. Yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't gotten to that level of granularity yet.
We got to start correlating good decisions with the recovery score.
Well, I just ordered mine. I don't have it yet, but it's coming. So
there you go.
Okay, well, we'll get you on it immediately. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got a good question here. I'll read it. Thanks for taking the time, Will. Can you talk about what, if any, effect tweaking and testing the business model had with your investor relationships? Because clearly, like, that's a difficult thing to test, especially, I actually think it's particularly hard with a hardware device. It's not like you can just do like a really easy A/B test and, it's purely software. You can like light it up one moment and turn it off the next. Like, how was that process?
And by the way, I think it's the question. I'm not sure if the person who asked it was what meant with your existing relationships, existing investors, or as you talk to new investors after manage. I think both of those are probably interesting perspectives.
Well, new investors love it because we look a lot more like a SaaS business than a hardware business, and you can do research on multiples there, but it's a profound difference. The existing investor base, I think, was, it was ultimately supportive, but there was a fair amount of deliberation around it. And, I think, you guys probably see this with your other founders. Like, I think in building a business, the founders, probably make a few decisions along the way that are kind of like bet the business decisions. And that to me felt like I was willing to bet the business on it. I just had felt that strongly about it by the end of it. And I think if you have a healthy relationship with your investors and you have that level of conviction around a decision where you're like, this, I completely believe in this, I'm willing to bet the business on it, you should get a favorable response. And, I think fortunately I've had a good relationship with our investor base, NextView included.
And turns out you were right also. That is being right.
It helps to be right. Yeah. Yeah.
So in our maybe we can talk about like some non-Whoop stuff with some ideas that I thought were really intriguing that you'd emailed me about. So how about some thoughts on kind of the future of sports post COVID. Obviously, this is a unique time when everything is getting canceled, and it'll be interesting to see what the fans' relationship with sports and the leagues are when everything opens up. And you had some interesting thoughts here, I thought.
Yeah. So just to back this up for a second, like I've felt for maybe 3 or 4 years that the rise of the sports industry at some point has to decline, or has to turn, and I think it's probably safer to look at this on a per sport basis. But essentially, there's like 4 to 6 sports that are massive sports leagues or organizations that I think the general consumer, or sort of the general population, just assumes is always going to exist. And my point of view is actually that one of those major sports organizations, sports leagues, will disappear in the next decade. And I felt this independent from COVID-19, but I think COVID-19 amplifies its likelihood. Now, okay, well, first of all, why did you believe that before COVID-19? So I think that sports are dealing now with more competition than they've ever dealt with before. At the end of the day, it's an entertainment industry. And so, there's Netflix and Fortnite and esports and people wanting to go to bed and sleep more. And, you can probably add another, 5 to 10 things that maybe even didn't exist 5 years ago that are like major entertainment drivers today. And I don't believe that we're going to live in a society where you spend 18 hours a day consuming entertainment. So, that pie has to come from somewhere. And I believe that the sports that don't innovate and don't meaningfully change certain aspects that they've always assumed are like the right thing are going to fail over time. And the reason I think COVID-19 amplifies the likelihood of this is that we're all now realizing that there are other behaviors and other things that we can do outside of watch sports to entertain us. And just the longer that goes on, the more people are building behaviors outside of watching fill in the blank sport every night. I also just think that the sports industry has been so successful that I don't think it even fully recognizes how it could fail. And that to me is the perfect recipe for failure.
Don't you think that these leagues are a little bit more like robust, that if there is kind of a downturn in demand, as you describe, it'll be a shrinking as opposed to like the entire league will fail? Or is there something about the cost structure that just makes it impossible for them to survive like a 20% decline in audience or viewership?
Well, I guess we can debate what it means to disappear, but like, go from watching this thing on, it's on a television channel every night to effectively being the equivalent of what like maybe AAA baseball is or something right now. Like, it's so completely different than what you remembered it as that it almost feels like it's gone. I think you're probably right to sort of poke at, well, is it really that it doesn't exist, or is it just that it's meaningfully worsened? But my sense is that it's gonna for again, I think it'll probably be 1 or 2, but it'll look very different than it does today.
Mm-hmm. We had a question about speaking of the sports leagues, around your experience trying to get the sports industry to approve Whoop for use on the field or on the court or in gameplay. Is that something you guys have actively been engaged with? How do you engage with the league? What are some of the hesitations? Because in a way, like, what are some of the hesitations and where does it typically come from? Just interesting question, I thought.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I guess as some background, so Whoop is approved to be worn in Major League Baseball. We are partners with the NFL Players Association. So we're the official wearable of the NFL Players Association. So we're distributed to every NFL player each year. And NBA players are not technically allowed to wear whoop during games. However, if they wear whoop during games and they are caught, they are not fined. So you can explain that one for me. And NHL players wear whoop during games, and I guess those are 4 of the major ones. Golfers obviously are allowed to wear whoop on the golf course. And look, all of those practices were different in part because of the way that these leagues and players associations have relationships. So every year there's what's called a collective bargaining agreement, and the collective bargaining agreement determines various rights that the players have versus the league. And in the case of wearables and data, it actually varies a lot by league. So in the NFL, for example, they gave a lot of the rights to the PA around health data. And so as a result, we were negotiating with the Players Association about having whoop on NFL players. In Major League Baseball, it was the opposite. Major League MLB PA gave a lot of those rights to MLB around who owns data, who controls distribution, things like that. So our deal was directly with Major League Baseball in that case. The NBA actually has a joint wearables division, which includes representatives from the NBA and the NBPA. So that, anyway, that's some background, and we continue to work with all of them.
Cool. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to probably wrap up pretty soon. I think we got to most of the questions. There's 1 or 2 we weren't able to get to, but we'll try to get to as many as we could. So first off, Will, thanks for joining us. It's always fun to, we've been trying to do these now for the last few weeks, with guests from, other folks in the startup and VC industry. And, we, the NextView team, enjoy, catching up with folks and picking their brains. And I think, the other folks who participate enjoy it as well. So thanks very much for your time. And thanks for everybody who joined us today. Again, we're doing these roughly once a week or so. There's been 1 or 2 weeks that we've missed, but if you're interested in participating in the future, keep an eye out to our email list and Twitter and stuff like that. And thanks very much for everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, NextView. Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for everyone watching.
Take care.
All right, bye.